Hello again to FlowCon 2022. My name is Tim Shimeall. I'm part of the CERT Directorate of the Software Engineering Institute and working with the Situational Awareness Group. It's a pleasure to be talking to you today. My topic is on sensing in hybrid clouds. When we're talking about sensing in hybrid clouds, a hybrid cloud infrastructure is one in which, in addition to using multiple cloud infrastructures, there's also a local infrastructure that's involved in storing and processing data of interest. In this particular case, probably security data. So the diversity of cloud and local storage also provides for a diversity in analysis and sensing operations. And we're going to explore some of that diversity as we go through this presentation. So briefly, since clouds are involved, the cloud vendor is going to be a player, but the topic of monitoring in the cloud isn't strictly just a vendor issue, and we'll explore why that is in place. Then we're going to shift more into the security model and what it is we're sensing for as security professionals. We'll talk about turning the data into information and how that is different within the hybrid cloud environment. And then we'll lightly touch on monitoring capabilities that currently exist and some of the alternatives that organizations have. So, cloud hosting services exist to provide platforms and infrastructures based on the contracting that has been placed. There's multiple different cloud models that are out there, including infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service models. A given organization using multiple clouds will probably have a diversity of cloud hosting options that are in process of being used. What the vendor guarantees to provide is the provision of this platform or service. They don't really get into what's the content, what's the configuration, what is the security related to that service, except as it ties to their mission of providing the baseline platform and activity. That means that while provisioning is part of the contract with the cloud service provider, it's also the responsibility of the using organization. And I'll just call that the organization as opposed to the provider. It's important that the organization identify their specific hosting requirements and also their specific hosting expectations. And in particular, what security, monitoring, awareness, reporting is going to be provided by the provider. You need to compare your expectations and requirements against their contract statements, because very often organizations are surprised by what parts are the service provider will or will not be responsible for. The organization is going to be responsible for the content. The provider is generally going to be responsible for the infrastructure required to reach that content. The provider is going to be interested in activity. The organization is going to be concerned particularly about security abuses, corruption of information, those kinds of things. So a using organization often, particularly in the hybrid model, will host services using more than one vendor. You may have vendors which use, or providers which involve Amazon and AWS cloud hosting. You may have Google and the Google Cloud. You may have Verizon Cloud and other cloud service providers that are out there. And it's important to understand the trade-offs and the risk. The cloud providers generally adopt a shared responsibility model. And this specifically, it's contrasted against the traditional IT model. In the traditional IT model, where you're fielding your own services completely, you're responsible for everything from the basic network connectivity on up through the application security. And a lot of the traditional presentations that have been made here at FlowCon insert sensors really at multiple levels of this stack. In particular, having sensors that are working at the networking level and collecting network flow data or packet data that's in place, having sensors that operate on servers, and this may include things like Bro or its successors that are there. You may have things which are directed to applications and some of the application-based information. And you may have runtime sensors within the operating system. And all of this is going to be integrated within your security stack. When you start shifting to the cloud, some of those layers are basically unavailable to you. They are contracted away in order to support the cloud operation. And that includes the network layer, storage layer, server layer, visualization layer, virtualization layer, and parts of the operating system layer. Essentially, when you're even within infrastructure as a service, you generally are saying, I want these kinds of systems hooked up in this kind of a way, and the actual hardware and virtualization that hosts that infrastructure is pretty much invisible to you. You don't know the hardware that's there. You don't know what's going on. You know a route, you know an access point, but you don't know that, and so you cannot monitor it. That means your monitoring shifts from being focused predominantly at the networking and up through the operating system level to things which are much more application level. What's going on in various servers, what's going on middleware layer, what's going on during runtime, and what application logs are present. And that greatly shifts the focus of a lot of network security groups and the monitoring that's doing. When you shift to platform as a service, there, everything up through the runtime layer is delivered as a service to you under the contract. You're simply responsible for loading up the application programs, loading up the relevant data, and monitoring that. And again, all you have visibility really on are what applications are running, what data. You have very limited visibility on the operating system level because it's basically covered by the provider. When you move to software as a service, essentially all that you know is what you contract the provider to tell you. So, and many of these providers do have security information available or application information available, but much of that, since the goal of the provider is provision rather than security, most of it is showing, gee, this platform's running, the access, the response time is thus and so, you've had contacts from these addresses. It doesn't necessarily contain the detailed log information that you may be used to seeing, and it doesn't necessarily contain information in the formats you're used to seeing. So there's as you shift to the cloud, there's going to be a lot of changes, both in terms of what formats you're going to see and what content you're going to see. And this is also reflected in the responsibilities that are present. When it's on-prem, the responsibility is pretty clear. It's all to the customer. When you're shifting into infrastructure as a service, well, physical security, that's on the provider. Everything from operating system security, network security, to limited on the application end, that's all going to be the responsibility of the customer. So providing keys, making sure that the networking stack is operating properly, that will all be on the customer. When you shift to platform as a service, the keying and the network provision and the application configuration becomes shared between the customer and the provider, the using organization and the provider. And then when you shift to security as a service, essentially what you're focusing on at this point is credentials, the endpoints that are allowed to access stuff, and the data governance, what is and is not allowed to be present on that. And generally, that's being specified and enforced as a policy. So as you move to security in the hybrid cloud, there we're deploying not just one of these security models, but multiple of these security models. I may have multiple cloud providers, some of which I use for infrastructure as a service to provide for remote access to services by my employees. Others are software as a service for things like email, file storage, team communication. All of those are provided through cloud-based applications as applications, not as an infrastructure. In addition, I may be maintaining a variety of on-premises activities where I have particular local servers which are used for communication and computation. I may have local data being collected and processed. And now suddenly I don't have one data source that I have large amounts of control over the format and the data. I've got a variety of data sources, and the data sources provide me with very varying views of visibility into there. I just don't have the chance to see as much in the cloud as I do with my on-prem services, and trying to match the on-prem visibility with the cloud visibility becomes a problem. You do have local administration. You do have the shared responsibility model. You have both. You do have mission and load balancing requirements between your on-premises activity and your cloud hosting activity. You do also still have your on-prem security, and your concern may be who's reaching us through the cloud that might be affecting some of our local security. What's going on with our local security that may be affecting the security of activity in the cloud, particularly with respect to insider threat. So, and finally, the interaction between on-premises activity and cloud assets really becomes a key focus in hybrid cloud infrastructures and hybrid cloud hosting. In addition, there's just an increased amount of data that's going to be present. Again, what used to be local sensing within the infrastructure is still going to be present. What is going to be contracted data sources coming from the cloud is also going to be present. It's going to be high velocity data. It's going to involve both traffic summary and capture and also service logging. We're going to simply have an awful lot of security data that's present, and we need to make very careful decisions about where all this data is going to be so that it's most accessible when we need it. One option is host it all in the cloud. I have all the data being hosted in the cloud and do all the processing in the cloud. That may be most cost efficient, but if you are experiencing a networking issue, then you're going to face gaps in your ability to access all this information. And the gaps in that access could be very critical in terms of tracing down the activity. The flip side is host it all locally. And that turns out to be extremely expensive. Clouds generally are much more comfortable hosting the material in the cloud and charge much less to keep the data than they do to transmit the data off the cloud. You may have several different varieties of cloud storage which are available. Hot storage, where you have rapid access and direct accessibility of things. Warm storage, where data is summarized and perhaps a little bit less detailed than what we present in hot storage. And cold storage, where there's archival information preserved that may be called upon when needed, but it can be pretty slow to access and somewhat more expensive to access, but it is able to hold much larger data. And the cost becomes a cost trade-off between how much data you want to process versus how much data you want to hold. You may have data warehouses again, which are going to add complexity there. And you've got, again, the question of what's going to be in-house on premises, what's going to be in the cloud. And more computing infrastructures are really pushing organizations to move into the cloud simply for cost savings. It isn't necessarily reflected in increased reliability or increased security of the data. So you need to properly look at what is going to be involved to protect access to your security data, what's going to be involved in what forms are you going to store it in, and how are you going to spread the information to make sure it is accessible even in the face of networking issues. It may be that you pre-process a bunch of the security data that's in the cloud and send summaries down to a local infrastructure just simply for availability reasons. Those kinds of systems are also being explored. Finally, there are third-party organizations which are quite happy to have you contract with them. They will put in place their sensing infrastructure working with your cloud provider, and then they'll process the information and send you reports of anomalies that they detect. The flaw there is you're losing even more visibility. You're only seeing the processed results. You're not seeing the final outcome results or the data that led to that final outcome result. So when you're dealing with the mixed security issues, well, there's issues that come into place about how do we detect events, because events are going to be different depending on whether you're looking at an event at an application stored in the cloud or through a gateway within your local network, and try to draw the equivalent between can be very, very difficult. The way the cloud represents things and the way your local network perceives things are very different. And clouds often have a specific identifier that they are making use of, and mapping that identifier to an IP address or to a service, a particular sequence of packets can be quite challenging. You often have to work with your provider specifically to make sure that the infrastructure monitoring is at least somewhat visible to you, so that you have some access to that. Many providers provide that kind of material, but there's usually extra cost involved in getting some of this. They see it as a cost center or a profit center that they can get. And so you need to be involved in some of that. In terms of the client shared responsibilities, you need to be able to profile systems, services, and usage, and be able to match that against desired behavior. And you will have responsibility for incident response and for incident coordination, involving not just all the typical people that you've coordinated with for incident response and security coordination, but also now the new set of cloud security providers that you're making use of. Often what is very difficult to get from the cloud-based information is the context. You get an alert, you get an exception, going back and saying, well, how does this compare to previous activity? Unless you specifically are able to look into your service logs and what limited network information they provide, can be very difficult to say what led up to this and what's involved. You may still have access to your local sensing infrastructure and be able to say, well, okay, I saw that we see this kind of precursor activity, but we don't see it coming from our local network. The flaw there is in the modern world, a lot of the connections may not necessarily go through your local network. You may have clients operating from people at home, and they interface directly with the cloud, with your local infrastructure not even being part of the connection, or maybe only establishing the connection and not being part of the ongoing interaction. That context is really key to identifying what could be a precursor to malicious activity, what could be a result of malicious activity, what could be a false alarm in terms of the alerting that's going on. And then how do we break it down into which sequence of actions are going on, and that's microanalysis, and the macroanalysis of connecting all of the sequence of events into a plausible chain of what actually was the activity and how was that impact manifested. Finally, trying to come up with what it is you can report all of this and who you can report it to also becomes much more complicated. Generally, you're going to have interaction with the cloud service provider saying, okay, here's the result that we got, are we releasing anything that we're prevented from by our hosting contract? And again, you need to be really well aware of what the hosting contract requires in terms of disclosure from you. In terms of monitoring capabilities, we want to specifically focus our monitoring on where address spaces are changing. We want to be able to establish as much as we can correspondences between local activity and activity in each of the cloud service providers that we're contracting for. And that requires an awful lot of thought. That requires an awful lot of planning. You're going to have traffic volume differences because the hosting infrastructure will consume some of the traffic. The hosted infrastructure, the hosted services, the hosted software isn't going to see everything that your organization is sending to it, and maybe sending things in much more summary fashion than what your organization actually receives. You're going to see port protocol differences because often when you're connecting to the cloud, you're actually connecting to a gateway. The gateway goes off to where the hosting is actually occurring. Often you may see tunneling occurring across that, and some of that also imposes delays on the traffic, such that an event at the client end of things may be very different from an event in the cloud end of things, and events themselves may not be precisely interleaved. You may have differences in what you see on both sides. Some of that is due to proxies, some of that's due to retransmission, some of it is because largely what we can see on the client end is a traffic view. What you see in the cloud is much more a service or an infrastructure view. And again, this imposes difficulties in de-interleaving. It is also the case that you can expect the data coming out of the cloud to be somewhat incomplete. And so as you go through your analysis processes, you want to look to see what can we map up and what we can't. Is what we can't due to malicious activity or due to the cloud-based definitions of things. And there's going to be a lot of that. All of this is going to impose specific visibility blind spots. And so as we move into more advanced cloud monitoring, we want to be focused in on where are those blind spots. How do we get visibility into the blind areas? And if we can't get visibility, how do we establish at least some sort of bridge that indicates one corresponds to the other? This is something that you're going to evolve over time. It's not necessary. There's no turnkey out-of-the-box solutions that will give you the visibility you need. And that's pretty widely recognized across the cloud communities. So in summary, we're going to use hybrid clouds. We're going to use hybrid clouds because of cost. We're going to be using hybrid clouds because the software vendors are increasingly incentivizing transition to clouds and to a variety of different clouds. So as you're using a variety of different software, you're going to be using multiple clouds, but most organizations are not going to completely give up their local infrastructure as well. So we need to address the monitoring issues that we brought forward in this presentation. We need to address the analysis challenges. And we as a community, involving both commercial end, academic end, and governmental end, are going to balance a degree of different efforts that are going to be responsible for dealing with that. Hope this has been a useful presentation to you. Should you have additional questions, I look forward to the question and answer session, but you can certainly contact me after the talk using this kind of information. And I thank you very much.
Some good questions for Tim, so let's get right to them. First one, Tim, can you share any experience or guidance when correlating or deduplicating monitoring input from different parts of cloud deployments that are from different CSPs, presumably with differing monitoring options?
That is a definite challenge. It's one that a lot of organizations face when they're trying to improve their visibility. What you basically need to do for deduplication is look to see what characteristics you can compare. Timestamp is often a big one if you can get enough precision. Source IP addresses of traffic can be useful, although some organizations load balance in a way that conceals the address. Beyond that, it's a definite challenge.
And next we have, how much of an issue are organizations facing regarding balancing auditing requirements against reduced visibility that comes with cloud services?
There again, it's a very good question. It's a very definite, pertinent issue. You need to make sure when you're doing your cloud contracting that the facilities you need for auditing are included, either by having the cloud service provider support the audit or by ensuring that you've got enough exposure of data to where you can satisfy the audit needs.
Okay, next time we have a question about training. Where does training fit into all this in a switch? How big of a deal is this something you have experience with? What advice do you have in the area of training and for organizations interested in making a switch over?
Well, this particular presentation was actually an excerpt out of a training session that we put together. So we do have some training options that are available to it. There are actually several groups at the SEI who are looking at cloud issues and incorporating cloud into training, whether from a technical end or a policy end or the network governance end of things. So there are a variety of SEI-based training options. There are also some good third-party options that are out there. Certainly getting training and understanding security in the cloud is going to be very important for most organizations moving forward. So yes, training is definitely a factor. Starting off with some of the SEI training and building off into third-party training might be a good strategy for organizations.
Okay, from Jim in Discord asking, it seems like your talk was focused on network traffic logs in hybrid environments and not endpoint logs. Is that correct?
Predominantly, yes. While you can invoke some of the network traffic logs, or pardon me, the host logs in there, in the hybrid environment, the host logs often are quite selective. You only see a very narrow slice of traffic on there. And for software as a service logging, you've got to see what the contract will provide for you.
So I'm going to put you on the spot. We got about a minute left, Tim. I read in your bio, you were I think the only one that has attended all 15 FlowCons. Is that correct?
There's been more than 15 now, but yes, I'm the only one that's been at all of them.
How about a favorite moment or a favorite presentation?
Honestly speaking, my favorite presentation was one that George Wernigerus did at the 15th FlowCon. And he did the 10th FlowCon. And it was memorable most for its humor. But he focused in on what are the security challenges facing organizations and did a marvelous job at it. He set the bar that I've not been able to match, nor have I seen a presentation that did. So that was a favorite moment. Somebody mentioned a little earlier in this conference about missing sliced pineapple. I was actually doing some training at FlowCon. I'm going to guess it was about 8 years ago. And one of my participants actually started choking on a piece of sliced pineapple. And an SEI staffer came up behind him and gave him the Heimlich maneuver.
Wow.
So that was probably the most drama I've seen at FlowCon.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that, Tim. Thank you for sharing your expertise as well with the FlowCon crowd here today.
My pleasure.